This is my narrative as of right now. And a lot of people are missing the train. They don't know what's going on. That's brokers, that's owners. You cannot afford to make mistakes right now. Welcome to the Dirt Podcasts. I'm Miles Solomon. Every week, I share my perspective on commercial real estate and the business of trading dirt. Let's get into it.
Nothing in this podcast is legal, tax, or investment advice. It's for entertainment only, loosely inspired by real estate, and any resemblance to actual people, deals, or outcomes is accidental or aggressively fictionalized. Talk to your attorney, CPA, and advisors before acting on anything you hear.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. On today's podcast, I'm going to talk about some really serious life safety stuff that everyone needs to be aware of. First of all, I had some friends over on Monday. If you're going to take a pizza that you order and try to heat it up in the box because you think low temperature, what could go wrong, make sure you don't put the box next to the heating element, or else your party will be interrupted by a giant flame coming out of the oven. I almost burnt the house down. Just a little oversight. But believe it or not, I was actually able to save the pizza and the house at the same time. I brought it directly to the sink and I hit it with just enough water that the flame went out and my hands only got slightly singed without making the pizza too sloppy. So you got to be careful out there, folks. You got to be careful. I've been on a lot of job sites that they are not careful. And you just see crazy shit. So for one, if you're touring on yards, make sure that if you don't have high visibility, normally I have high vision helmets in my back of my car that I'll share with clients and that I'll put on myself. But make sure you stay away from machinery. I've seen guys almost get run over by like 50,000 pound machines and the operator wouldn't have even known it. When you get a new listing, especially if it's like manufacturing or, some kind of heavy industrial, it's good to talk to the tenant and just say, hey, is there anything I need to know? Usually they'll know and they'll let you know. But sometimes you got to just kind of look around and use your best discretion. And on that note, just housekeeping wise, when you're doing tours, there's nothing worse than when someone's running an actual business and there's just people walking through it like they're at a theme park and just like wandering around in the way of forklifts so be mindful of that. In other news, I was having a conversation today about comps, and that's one of the main ways that you value properties, right? Based on the comps. And the conversation was about leases and the comps that we get on leases. And we are pretty fanatical about getting new comps. When we left our old office, our Lee & Associates downtown LA used to be a part of a bigger Lee & Associates commerce office. And we left to go start a new office in an area that we needed to expand to in downtown LA. And when we left all our data there in terms of comps. So we had to start the system from scratch. And comps, as a lot of you know, are everything. Purchase comps, the sale comps, those are publicly listed unless you're in a state that doesn't do that. I know that some states don't publicly record the sale price. California is publicly listed. It's public information. It's pretty easy to get sale comps. Usually takes about 2 weeks. So we collect those from other brokers, and then we also collect them from the recorder's office, like using a GIS service that provides the comps. And that's how we kind of track sales of land and buildings in like the areas that we care about. I'm going to talk about valuation today, but I'm going to start with comps and kind of the collection process and how we look at them. Especially in a market like today, you can't just take a bunch of comps and average them up and say that's the comp for industrial buildings or land. It really doesn't work that way, especially right now, because it's so site specific that the comp is really going to depend on the individual qualities of the building. So it might be, the building, the construction type, the clear height, the class of building, like we talked about before. And it's also in combination with, the amount of yard, the specific area. So, literally it could be different a few blocks over depending on where you are. And then details of the sale, like why was it bought? And you can't get those from the recorder. How did the negotiation take place? When we see like a really meaningful comp, something that transacted that we want to hear the story behind, we'll literally call the broker and talk to them about it and hear if we don't already know the story. A lot of times, we'll know the story. Like, for example, Vernon has probably, I think we went through it last week. I think there's about 28 properties for sale in Vernon. And about 20 of those are pretty crappy buildings. So even if all of those sold tomorrow, you're not going to just look at those and average out. But then we went, building by building, what makes this building crappy? What makes this building crappy? And then when you kind of narrow it down, each category of building, so each size of building, there's only a couple. So there's only one building that's 25 to like 40,000 square feet in Vernon. That's a relatively nice building. And that's my listing at 3000 East 46th Street. Then when you get in the 50,000 plus or 50,000 to 80,000, there's about 5 buildings and that are good and, functional buildings. In the under 20, there's probably 7 buildings, and of those, really only a few of them are priced realistically, like maybe 3 of those. So when you get down into the details of each of these buildings, you see that like there's actually not that much supply. We said that there's 29 buildings, but in reality, there's only 11 functional buildings, and depending on the size range you need, there's only 2 or 3 buildings in each of those categories. So when you're looking at comps, you have to be, you have to know the story, and you have to know what makes this building and that building valuable. And so that's for the sale comps. For lease comps, it's even more complicated. But it's even more complicated in the sense that a lot of leasing depends on, like we talked about in the musical chairs episode, why was the tenant leaving? Were they under pressure? Lease comps can vary like extremely depending on conditions of like the lease, of why the tenant had to do that deal, or why the landlord had to do that deal. The property had been on the market for a year. They were super desperate. They wanted to get it done, so they bent over. Like there's things like that where, you can't just look at it in a vacuum. And when we were talking about this conversation about comps, and my assistant was asking me, so why do we share the comps with other brokers, and why do they share with us, and why aren't they just public? Well, the comps is like part of our trade craft, our trade secrets. It's the secret sauce of driving values of properties, values of new leases. And there's no reason to share them unless you're sharing them with someone who adds value to the market. So I think a big part of understanding especially where lease rates are, and like tangentially sale rates based off of lease rates in a lot of cases, like if it's an investment play, then the comp is going to be the most important metric of where values are at. So because our lovely state of California and a lot of states have the same license for commercial and residential, and on top of that, because you have a lot of even brokers within commercial that are not like serious full-time career brokers, the secret sauce of comps is, you share comps with people who are in the market, who are active, that are doing deals and sharing comps with you. That's information that the rest of the world does not have, whether it's Grok or ChatGPT or CoStar. I mean, CoStar does their best to try to get comps, but we don't share any comps with them. And anytime you see power broker under a broker's like signature, a CoStar power broker, it means they share all their comps with CoStar. And we don't need CoStar. I mean, we still have access to all of their comp because we pay them. I think our office pays like over $100,000 a year to CoStar to be able to advertise our properties. And that's really all we use it for, is to advertise to the public. We don't need their comps, and we don't rely on their comps. Sometimes out of market it's helpful, but very rarely. So when you're talking about comps, it's kind of the trade secret, and it keeps competitors out of the market. But secondly, every comp tells a story. And so you have to know what the story is, and you have to have the framework of understanding. You have to have enough comps in your system to understand them. You have to have enough understanding of the different buildings and what they are. So you can't just look at comps in a vacuum. So when we're valuing properties, we do a lot of what we do is providing free broker opinion of value to different clients or potential clients. So we're cold calling. A guy says, I want to know what my property's worth. And we say, okay, why do you want to know? What are you trying to do? Get a better understanding of it. And then if there's a connection there, it's valid, then we go to work on producing a broker opinion of value. And that broker opinion of value that we produce here in our office is based on 4 metrics. So we use an Excel program that has 4 different sheets that pulls data that you supply from we have an internal system that we use for tracking all the availables and comps and everything for lease and for sale. And what we do is we filter out the comps based on what we think is the appropriate comp to use for whatever the building is. What's a truly comparable building? And try to get rid of the outlying, like, random situation leases and stuff. And then our opinion of value is basically, one of them is the comps, one of them is the availables, the third is the replacement value of the property. So that's the same as if like an appraiser was doing replacement value for like an insurance, or an insurance adjuster was doing it. What would it cost to build that property today, build that building today? How much would the land cost? How much would the building cost for construction? For that, we use our numbers, a lot of which we get from Altman's Construction, which is a Southern California contractor. Shout out JP Gormley. And then our fourth will depend on the property, but it's kind of like an investor's look, like a value approach. So if an investor was buying it, what could they expect to get for rent? What kind of cap rate could you expect to get for that kind of property? And then what we do is we take those 4 values, each generating a different value, right? So it could be, let's say we're talking about a 10,000-foot building, like a very clean Class B with a dock and a nice yard, which doesn't really exist, but hypothetically, that's the building we're looking at. So we could say that the comps are around $330 a foot. The availables are usually going to be higher, around $370 a foot or $360 a foot, let's say. 15% higher, it sounds about right. And then the replacement value, well, that land's probably worth let's call it $100 a foot on the land. It's a 20,000 foot lot, so that's $2 million on the land. And then the cost on the building is probably, let's say, smaller buildings, much more expensive to build. The price per square foot is much more expensive. Assuming it's a concrete building, let's say it's, I don't know, let's say it's $150 a foot. So that $3.5 million, then we usually put like a depreciation number on it because it's not a brand new building. So what's the cost of the replacement of a used building, less the wear and tear. So maybe it's like 30% off of that, and that's how we get that number. And then from an investment standpoint, how would we, our income approach to value? Right now, that building really depends who you ask, but I would say it's probably worth around like $1.30 a foot net per month. Again, California, we do price per square foot per month. A lot of the country does per year. Our values are so high for a lot of stuff that you have to do it per month. So let's say it's $1.30 net. So then we'd multiply the $1.30 net by the square footage of the building, and we'd get 13,000 a month times by 12, 156,000 net, meaning the tenant pays property tax, insurance, etc. And then maybe that's in today's market, that's worth probably a 6 cap. So that's $2.6 million. And then we take those numbers, and depending on those 4 different numbers, and depending on what kind of building we're trying to value, if it's an investment play, it's a user play, we'll weight those categories differently and we'll blend them together. And that gives, kind of our broker opinion of value. And then obviously you meet with the owner. A lot of times owners just want you to email it to them. As a rule, we kind of, we're not working for free. We want to generally meet with the owner and see the building, talk to them face to face. So we set up a time to meet with them and go over the kind of broker opinion of value in person. Another thing that you deal with a lot is they ask for a broker opinion of value from you, and then they also ask from it for 2 other people, and they might have different opinions than you do. And some of it comes down to competence, of if their value's vastly different than yours, one of you is wrong. And that's kind of based on like their experience in the market, their understanding of the comps, the availables. If this is a guy that just does a few deals a year, they might not know where the market's at today. Or if they're, a friend of the owner's family who's like a residential agent, and again, going back to the comps, they don't have access to the same comps. They don't have the same understanding of the market. So their number might be very different. And then you might be going against some real competitors, like people that are equally qualified as you, and your numbers should be fairly similar. For me, I always try to have like a story that I'm telling when I get in front of an owner and I'm talking about a broker opinion of value. I want to be able to say why I think that the value's X and where I think the market's going, what the marketing process looks like. We've had coaching over the years with different coaches in terms of pitching business and winning business. And a lot of it's nonsense. Some of it's valuable. I think one of the most valuable things that I've learned is really getting an understanding of what the client's looking for and what they want and need. You have all these brokers that are going in there and me this and me that, and this is what we do. And so before I get into the actual pitch on our services, the building, what we're doing, I try to understand exactly what the client's looking for. And then on the spot, I will tailor everything to that. Generally, I'd like to have that before the meeting if we can, but they're not always willing to like get into the details prior. So, an example of that's like if there's a partnership dispute and they just want to sell this thing and move on. Well, when I'm pitching business, I'm pitching a lot of times for a sale that might take 4 to 8 months in this market. Do they have that kind of timeline? Because if they don't, then you're probably at, 75 cents on the dollar or something, and that's important information to share. If they've owned it forever and they have a very low basis and they don't care, they want their number, that's a different story. If they bought it more recently and their expenses are extremely high, or if they have a tenant that's leaving and they rely on this income, or they're, stuff like that, that's context that you really need to know. So listening to the client before you get into your spiel about your services and what you do and what the value is and all of that is really important. And I think that's a way that we win over a lot of clients over our competitors. Is we don't just get in there and we're like, this is who I am, this, and beat your chest. You really want to understand what the client's trying to do, where they're coming from, and tailor your pitch to that, and tailor your pricing and everything to that, to some extent. Obviously, you can still have, this is the pricing. It's objective to some sense, but this is the context of why this is the pricing. So if you give us a long runway of 4 to 8 months and you want to go for the most aggressive pricing, then this is what you can expect. And then, in today's market, the caveat would be the market's also going down. So this is based on today's pricing. It's possible in 4 to 8 months, when we find a likely buyer, that the pricing will be 10 or 15% below that. So I think showing your competence and being, you have to be fully in the business, right? You can't be just in and out. A lot of guys are on vacation all the time, or they're not fully in the business and they don't know what's going on, that's a fine way for a lifestyle business. But like, if you're a career broker and you're really in this business, then you need to, especially in a market like right now that's so dynamic and is changing. Like, every month pricing is going down, inventory is going up. The narrative from when I started this podcast to now, which has only been, 4 months, has changed a lot, and it will continue to change. So you're trying to see around the curve. You can't see entirely, but you're trying to get a sense of like what's coming, and your pricing and your pitch need to reflect all of that. So I'll generally give a range of pricing. For example, going back to the 10,000 foot building, I think that we could expect $325 to $350 a foot. If we execute a deal within the next 6 months. If it goes on, and then if I'll have very good feedback in 60 days if I'm correct on that. Being able to be, somewhat humble, and this is not a science. There's lots of scientific stuff about it, but it's also an art form, and it's dynamic and it's changing. So, having the humility to explain that to the client as well. And, I don't think that there's anything wrong with not having all the answers, or, not being able to say 100% certainty, this is what I would expect, this is the bottom line. It's changing every day. And the way that I demonstrate value right now is the market is changing rapidly, and a lot of people this is my narrative as of right now, and a lot of people are missing the train. They don't know what's going on. That's brokers, that's owners. You cannot afford to make mistakes right now in terms of pricing, marketing. You need to go with someone, and you need to be very sure when you go out to the market. You can't do this TBD pricing. I'll say there are brokers that will come to you and say that pricing is so difficult right now that I think we should go out as TBD. That's a huge mistake, huge mistake in today's market. Nobody wants to call or deal with people that don't want to put the pricing out there. You got to put the pricing out there, and your pricing's got to be correct, and it's got to be aggressive, and you got to want to win the next deal. And you got to have people working to that end. If you've got guys that are, oh yeah, we'll get the next one, blah, blah. By the time they figure out their act and that buyer comes, pricing in today's world could be 10, 15% off of where you started at. So, I wish that I had more opportunity to go against other brokers and to compete more. A lot of times, because there's so many buildings, like in LA County, there's probably, I don't know, 10,000 industrial buildings, I would guess. And there's probably 1,000 of those are good buildings, about 10%, I think, probably. And, within my market, it's probably 600 or 700 buildings. A lot of those buildings, even though I cold call the owners, I send postcards, I send emails, I never get an opportunity to get in front of them because either they've got relationships that go back 40 years with brokers that should have retired many years ago, or they go with someone that, random, that happens to call them on the right day. And there is a randomness to it. There's guys that are just cold calling every day, random people off of lists, and they get the guy at the right time, right place, and they get a listing. That's fine. But I really would like the opportunity to pitch for more business and show owners why I'm the right fit. And when I'm not the right fit, I'll also say that, hey, I don't think this is the right building for me, or I don't think I'm the right person for this. However, I know the right person. So, one thing I'll do a lot is when I pitch business, like especially when I'm going for, yards and stuff, and they say, yeah, we got to think about it, but we'd also like to, get some other opinions. A lot of times I'll give them who I think my true competitors are. So at least then I know, like, it's an even playing field in terms of, like, they're not going to get someone random and they're saying their property's worth 2 times or 3 times what it's actually worth. If we're, like, actually competing based on skill and our knowledge and our what is that? Likeness? How likable we are, your charisma, the other things. I'd rather pitch on an even playing field against real competitors than random Joe Blow that fills, the owner's head with nonsense. So I'll give the names of, like, actual competitors of mine who are very good. And, especially when it comes to yards, there's only a few guys that I consider, like, extremely knowledgeable about yards. And so I will give that contact information and be okay knowing that, okay, if I have to go against, someone, at least I'm going against, like, peers, and we can compete on skill. So, I think that in today's world, there's so much information and knowledge, and it's easier than ever to contact people and get in front of owners, that a lot of people have, like, blinders on, and they don't look at their email, and they don't answer their phone, and it's getting more and more difficult to get in front of people. And so it's something I think we have to work on going forward. Like, how do we show them that we are the right people for the job, and how do you win new business like that? I think getting in the door and getting in front of people, a lot of brokers feel really confident. Like, if I sit down with an owner, I can win the business. And there's a lot of guys out there that I know feel that way, and they're probably right. But if they had more competition in front of their owners, I think it would be good for the market. There's a lot of guys that are not working as hard as they should be. That, there's guys that get listings and they put their listing, they sign up a listing agreement. They don't put it on the market for like 2 months because they're trying to shop their own deal and find their own user. And, there's all kinds of practices where I think if, there was better competition, and I'm looking forward to that from a technology standpoint. I think that, being able to get in front of more owners, maybe I'll get more opportunities to do that. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what all the fallout of new technology and stuff is going to be, but I've definitely come across it already where, I talked about AI with partners and how, I've had some partners on deals that send me AI slop about this and that. And I've talked about maybe, different contract clauses and stuff that AI's gotten involved because someone's asked. I had, for the first time, really, I had a call with an owner last week who he had put all the information about his business and the building and all that into Grok. And he had gone like very deep. And this is an older guy in his late 60s. And he'd gone like very deep with AI and talking about, you know, how AI, what AI's opinion, what Grok's opinion of value was. And this was one of the first times that I had to really refute what he was saying, not because AI is necessarily, you know, just out of its depth or, you know, I don't think that AI is an advanced spell checker. I heard that on a podcast recently. I don't think that. I think there's a lot more potential than that, but it is very like sycophantic. It'll tell you a lot of times what you want to hear. It doesn't really understand, at least right now, until we get to the point of general intelligence. The AI doesn't really understand the subtleties, and it has a hard time saying no or you're wrong. And I don't know why that is. I'm not sure if that's because the nerds in Silicon Valley like when people tell them yes and like when their AI tells them how much they love them, or if it's more complicated. Like, you know, it seems like a lot of times when you ask a question to AI, it has to be like a leading question, and it provides a framework for the AI to work around a question. That's something I think a lot happens, like just the way it's almost like when you watch like Law and Order, when they're cross-examining a witness and they're leading the witness, things like that, where the way you ask, isn't it true that X? I think AI works a lot like that, where based on the framing of the question, it automatically has a bias to it. But in this specific example, the owner had convinced himself, and Grok had helped convince him, that his property was extremely unique because of the permitting. They have a recycling business, and he's convinced that because of the permits that they have through AQMD and their use permits, and the built-out operation of that property, that it's worth an extreme premium, that you can do it. He said, you can't do this business anywhere else in Southern California. And so I let him kind of finish speaking, and then I said, you know, basically, I understand what you're saying, and while it is valuable, it's a valuable permit, and it you know, you do have a lot going for your property because it's already all there and the equipment's there and stuff. That's definitely worth a premium. However, it's not worth. They were talking about actual values, and I was like, it's not worth what you're saying, which is, I think it was like $130,000 a month. It's not worth that. I can tell you that. And he goes, well, isn't, you know, you started talking about, I don't want to get too specific, in case, you know, any of this ever comes up. I don't want to dox the guy or say anything, but basically him and Grok had in their mind that $130,000 a month was very reasonable because, you know, the property was irreplaceable, et cetera. And I said, look, it's not irreplaceable. You can get this permit in other places. I know how to get the permit. I've done very similar permits, and I named a few cities and a few types of zonings and a few conditions that you can have and get the same permit. And it was like, wait, but he had been talking this thing for I don't know how many days, and they had come to like this conclusion that it was irreplaceable and that the cost of moving, and that was the second thing I said, look, it's expensive to move, but it's not tens of millions of dollars. Also, you know, your equipment is extremely old, and yes, it still works, but like, you know, maybe it's tens of millions of dollars if you're buying all brand new equipment, but the equipment comes with the property with that deal. So they could move your equipment, you know, it's like, so my advice was basically, I think it's worth around 75,000. If you could get 100,000, you should be ecstatic and you should do it. But it's definitely not worth 150,000. Then we talked about the value on a sale, and my number was like half of his number. And it was this time where the first instance I've had to kind of, we're in this weird state right now in technology where you have AI, which is kind of like a bad broker. Like there's some very good advice, but like it's only right like 70% of the time or 80% of the time, or and that's amazing. But if your employee was wrong 7 out of 10 times, you would fire them, or wrong 3 out of 10 times, you would fire them. Like it's still a large enough margin of error that, and more than that, what I've noticed is it can be fundamentally wrong. So right about all the other things, but like, for example, what we just talked about, the premise of that you cannot get that permit, that all of its research is based off of, its entire viewpoint is based off of, is wrong. So everything that comes from that is wrong. So I think, it's a very tricky time that we're in now, because we're already starting to compete against AI, not in the sense of, our competitor is not AI, but who does the client trust? Whose opinion and values does it trust? And, a lot of people's relationship with AI is beyond just that, right? They use it for everything. So it's proved to be a very trustworthy companion for a lot of things. And it's kind of sycophantic. So it, has a close relationship to a lot of people as like a trusted advisor, just like brokers are. And then you put this specific situation in it, and it's like all of a sudden my word versus theirs. And I can see a world definitely where we're not competing against AI, but everyone has a personal assistant, a personal intelligence assistant that provides them context in the way that they understand it and the voice that they do it. And you have to compete against that in terms of like who is correct. And there's no doubt in my mind that in this instance, Grok was wrong, 100%. I know that because I use AI all the time, and it's been wrong about so many things. And its understanding, of details is very good, but it can get concepts wrong. It gets a lot of like what's customary and how things are actually done in the real world wrong. So, now that we're dealing with this, you can't just ignore it and you can't just dismiss it. A lot of these older brokers that have been in the business for a long time that don't truly understand AI, or they themselves have like fallen in love with it, they're going to have a hard time being able to navigate this world of where you're working with your own AI and other people's AI, and also advising like, it doesn't have all the information. It doesn't have all or even most, or even, it doesn't really have the comps. It doesn't have a lot of the fundamental customary stuff about how real estate is done in your market, and how, it just doesn't have the context. It doesn't understand. And there might be a world one day where it does, but I think right now we're navigating this really tricky territory. And, I like it from the perspective that we got to be even better. And I'm imagining a world where, and I've talked about this a lot with my girlfriend, where I'm not going to go techno negative necessarily. There was this, it's a weird concept, but there was like this, I think it was on 4chan. One of the moderators about like 8 years ago believed in this concept called, I think it was called like the basilisk. And the idea was that when there's a sentient AI one day, like general intelligence, but kind of evil, it's going to go through all of the printed record, all of anything that's been recorded, written, and it's going to find the people that tried to prevent it from becoming alive, or from becoming a general intelligence. So like the idea was, I think I remember it, the story was someone was posting about how can we prevent this malicious AI from coming to exist one day. And the moderator of this like 4chan sub chat, whatever they called it, freaked out, because he thought just by saying that you wanted to prevent its existence, one day when the general intelligence master lord comes to existence, because he thought it was inevitable that one day it would, one day when it comes to existence, it's going to go back through and it's going to find that we were having this conversation about it, and it's going to kill us. And This is like a real like belief that this guy had, and it sounds fucking nuts. I get it, but also like there's some truth that AI at some point I think will achieve this like level of intelligence that's at least close enough to understanding, or that it looks like understanding, or its own version of understanding things. I don't believe in the basilisk. So if the basilisk one day is listening to this, you can go fuck yourself. And I look forward to waging war on robots if that's the case. But I don't believe that's a real likely scenario, at least for maybe like 100 years. At that point, all bets are off. But, the conversation I was having with my girlfriend was, in the meantime, I think it's going to be a very positive AI world, and it's going to be a glory age, at least for a while. And we need to learn how to like incorporate and work with AI, and it's going to make us way better, way more efficient. And I was looking at Anthropic release their like this chart of what jobs they projected would be the most affected by AI in the next, I don't know, 10 or 20 years. And you see like a lot of white collar jobs are there, and a lot of like architect, software engineers, lawyers, legal, them being really affected. And then you see kind of on the other end, the jobs and the businesses that were unaffected. And it was like trucking companies, construction companies, what else? Logistics, a lot of blue collar, this and that. And my thought when I was looking at the chart was like, I didn't look at the chart and go, oh, well, where's brokerage? Where am I on that chart? It was, for me, it was like, okay, the guys that I work with, and the women that I work with, the companies I work for, they're going to be doing well. So if they're doing well, I know I'll have a job. It's just a question of how I can incorporate AI into that job going forward and service those customers. So I think that's kind of the path that we have to weave for the next, foreseeable future, maybe forever, of how you blend the two. So I'm not a techno negativist. I'm more of a techno optimist. And fuck the basilisk. And I promise I won't talk about AI for a while.